Hello and welcome to the Super Casuals. My name is Auronado, and today we return to my series comparing the fundamentals of the World of Warcraft over time. Today we will be talking about the scale of the World of Warcraft. When the original World of Warcraft was released, the world itself was truly massive. As the various races adventured through Azeroth, they were sent across 2 colossal continents, each with more than a dozen zones. One of the most impressive features at the time was the lack of loading screens at the borders of zones. You could walk straight out of Thousand Needles and straight into Feralas, without so much as a system hiccup. Back then, you would not have access to a mount until at least level 40. You had to go everywhere on foot, and the slow speed of travel only made the world itself feel larger. Flight paths were few and far between, and you had to find them before you could use them. Zones rarely had more than 1 or 2 graveyards, so if you died, you might have to spend quite a while going back to your body. Quests often sent you across huge distances. The classes that had mobility boosts made the grind go by much faster, and made the classes that didn't have those boosts insanely envious. At the time, the only forms of instant transportation available were in the hands of warlocks, mages, and druids. Druids could teleport to Moonglade, and mages could teleport to the capital cities of their respective factions. Higher level mages could also open portals to those cities for other people to use. Warlocks had the ability to summon party and raid members to the warlock's location. The stones outside of dungeons and raids did not function the way they do today, and could not be used to summon people, so if you didn't have a warlock, everybody had to go to the dungeon or raid on their own. Transportation between continents was done via boats and airships. Only the boat from Ratchet to Booty Bay and back was neutral. The rest were docked in Alliance or Horde territory, and the transports themselves were on a 5-minute timer, so if you missed your ship, you were stuck standing around waiting for a little while. In essence, the scale of the world was enormous, and forcing players to move around at slower speeds only served to make the world feel larger. Once players had access to movement-increasing abilities or mounts, the world still felt huge because you would still spend a substantial amount of time traveling on foot. What Classic did well was having a massive world. What it didn't always do well was keep the player doing something more engaging than just running around. With the release of the Burning Crusade, we ventured through the dark portal to Outland. The Burning Crusade had 1 continent split into 7 different zones, and 4 additional zones were added to the Classic map for the Blood Elf and Draenei characters. Towards the tail end of the expansion, the required level for slower ground mounts was reduced from level 40 to 30. The Burning Crusade also introduced 2 new forms of travel. In Shattrath City, the new neutral city for all players, there were portals to all the major faction cities. Nearly all players now set their Hearthstone to Shattrath so that they could freely teleport to any city they want, either to go to said city, or as a means of traveling across large distances without the need of a mage. The new zones in Outland still had a limited number of flight paths, but did have more graveyards than Classic. You were still expected to spend most of your time on foot, at least until the Burning Crusade introduced flying mounts. Blizzard has since gone on record and admitted that flying mounts were a mistake, but here they were. The first flying mount was available at level 70, and was affectionately referred to as the Fat Kid mount, due to how incredibly slow it was. For what was, at the time, a hefty sum of 5,000 gold, you could upgrade the Fat Kid mount into a much faster flying mount. The flying mounts themselves were excessively convenient. You could now openly disregard most of the creatures of the world, you could avoid hostile players on PvP servers, you could bypass any of the world's dangers to collect trade skill nodes, and it just made the world itself feel smaller. Fortunately, you could not yet use those flying mounts in Azeroth, so the classic world was still just as large, besides the new ability to teleport from Shattrath City. Wrath of the Lich King introduced another new continent to the world, Northrend, and one small starter zone for the new Death Knight class. Northrend contained 8 questing zones this time, 1 PvP zone, and an additional zone in Crystal Song Forest that was unable to be used for much because the new neutral city, Dalaran, took up entirely too much of the system resources. Instead of one giant portal to one zone for all players, Wrath now had 2 zones each faction could enter, and separate methods per faction. One entrance became 4. However, like Shattrath City before it, the new neutral city Dalaran also had portals to the other cities, including Shattrath itself. Once again, everybody set their Hearthstone to Dalaran and teleported around freely. Zones now had lots of flight paths and lots of graveyards. Virtually all quests were from hubs, so there was very little aimless running around unless you were heading to a new hub or a new zone. This remains true all the way through Battle for Azeroth, though nowadays you'll often be sent to these new hubs on some form of in-game transportation. Wrath allowed players to start flying at level 77 instead of maximum level, because the zone's Storm Peaks and Ice Crown required flight for multiple quests. Later in the expansion, a tome was placed on a vendor that players could send to their lower level characters, allowing them to fly in Northrend right away. Also later in Wrath of the Lich King, the minimum level for slow ground mounts was further reduced from level 30 to 20, and the faster ground mounts were reduced from level 60 to 40. They were also made substantially cheaper. The ability to ride flying mounts in the Burning Crusade content was made available at level 60, down from 70, and the old Fat Kid mount was increased from 60% of run speed to 150%. Before players had access to flight, Northrend was a huge, beautiful landscape. Once we could fly again, we just ignored everything, and any traveling we did have to do felt like an inconvenience. This was around the time when some players started to realize how unhealthy flying was for the mindset of anybody playing the game. Unlike the previous expansions, Cataclysm did not introduce a new continent. Instead, Blizzard redid all of the old classic zones in Azeroth. In addition, the areas of Azeroth we could not explore before, such as Mount Hyjal, were now open to the players, alongside a couple of new areas. With the classic zones redone, flight in the old world was now possible outside of the TBC areas for the Draenei and Blood Elves. Blizzard did not put a max level requirement on flight this time, instead allowing players to fly straight away. Also unlike the previous 2 expansions, Cataclysm did not have a neutral city hub. However, Blizzard opted to put portals to all of the new zones in Stormwind City and Orgrimmar. Only these 2 cities had these portals, so they became the new go-to Hearthstone destinations for high-level players. The other faction cities became ghost towns as a result. Excluding Uldum, high-level players were now teleported in some way to all of their new questing zones. Uldum required you to fly down to Tanaris, but from there you were still teleported to the correct area. Cataclysm was the point when the cumulative changes to mounts, questing, transportation, and abilities turned the game into a treadmill. There were now so many forms of instant or super fast transportation that the scale of the world was now an inconvenience instead of a selling point, and it only got worse from there. Mists of Pandaria once again added a new continent for the players to explore. This time there was only one starter zone, though players were still split by faction. Once again we had a neutral city, and once again it had portals to the major faction cities. This time, rather than a pre-established landmark like the Dark Portal, or a new dock or port for airships and boats, we had a plain old portal stuck in, once again, Stormwind and Orgrimmar that sent you to the starting area for Mists once you wanted to go back. This came across as incredibly lazy on Blizzard's part. This time around, players were not allowed to fly in the new continent until max level. It was not possible to give lower level characters access to flying early the way that you could in Wrath of the Lich King. The only major changes to mounts this time around was allowing all non-class mounts to be used account-wide, so your low-level characters could now ride the super fancy creatures your main character had found. Warlords of Draenor gave us a new continent once again, splitting the Alliance and Horde players up into two separate zones. What Warlords did differently is that it never intended to give players access to flying mounts at all, nor at any point thereafter. There was a massive uproar on the official forums, and Blizzard eventually caved in, allowing players to unlock flying if they completed enough in-game tasks to prove they had done the content. This new meta achievement is the same system Blizzard used for both Legion and Battle for Azeroth, and is likely what they'll be using going forward. Unlike the neutral cities from previous expansions, in Warlords, players were mostly stuck in their garrisons while idle. Legion added yet again a new continent to the World of Warcraft. This time we were back in Dalaran as our neutral city hub. For any place that anyone wanted to go in the new Legion content, there were always very short distances to travel. Every possible location available in Legion was either a short flight path away, or you could simply teleport directly through some portal somewhere. As large as the zones seemed to be, they didn't feel very big when you could simply teleport or fly anywhere you wanted to go in a very short period of time. Battle for Azeroth added two new small continents in Kul Tiras and Zandalar. Like Legion before it, traveling around is very simple in Battle for Azeroth. There's a flight path to every important destination. Traveling from Kul Tiras to Zandalar, or the other way around, is mostly done through teleportation via talking to NPCs and feels incredibly lazy on Blizzard's part. Perhaps this is a placeholder before patch developments change the world, but that remains to be seen. In conclusion, Warcraft started off with a colossal world that transitions seamlessly from one area to the next. The game was designed to force players to run around exploring the zones, often to the point of excess. Only some classes had access to mobility spells, and mounts were both expensive and gated behind a high-level requirement. Instant forms of transportation were both rare and limited in scope. Over time and over expansions, mobility spells and abilities became more common. Mounts were now much cheaper and acquired much earlier. World transportation from one continent to another was shifted away from these slow airships and boats, only to be replaced by instant portals. Blizzard finally realized how much damage the convenience of flying mounts were causing to the mindset of players. But too little was done, and much too late. Players were now accustomed to very literally skipping over content to rush to endgame, and would not accept being grounded permanently. The inconvenience that players complain about so much is the danger of the world. And that will be the subject of the next video in this series. But until then, I thank you for watching the Super Casuals. My name is Auronado. Remember, keep it casual. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe if you'd like to see more.